if we could both of you on, I suggest we start to go through the questions. A number of them have been coming in as well, and I'm hoping there's time for me to sneak a question in also. But I'm going to go from the list first. So the first one is from Suraj. Suraj is saying, with so many different models and approaches used in the quantification, how do you ensure internal consistency?
Yeah, this is a really good question and a really key point. Really, it was embedded into our approach. So this kind of ordering of, well, we establish narratives, we then use those narratives to inform the development of the semi-quantitative trends and the quantitative data. I mean, that can feel like a bit of a linear process, but what we've deliberately done is we've sort of built feedback loops into that. So the narratives suggest you know, what should be happening in a particular SSP. We then use the models to design quantifications that we think are consistent with that, and sometimes the models tell us different things to the narratives. So in those cases, we have this feedback loop. We essentially go back to the narratives and say, well, actually, yeah, maybe there is a slight inconsistency here. Let's adjust the narrative and check that hangs together with the narrative. And then if it does, okay, fine, we can then sort of go with the new quantification, go with the quantifications and use that to inform the narratives, as well as it just being this. So it's not this kind of one-way flow, if you like. And in terms of consistency between indicators, I mean, in some cases you can do that explicitly. You know, I'm an economist by background, so the kind of thing I think about is if we're looking at GDP and we're looking at employment, well, those things are obviously very clearly linked, and you can sort of you can check that is doing something sensible by looking at productivity, which is essentially, you know, GDP divided by employment. So there's a lot of these kinds of links that and they form a key part of the checking, is to sort of look at the internal consistency and check the sort of the realism, if you like, in those, between those specific variables. Excellent,
thanks, John. I think next we've got a couple of questions from RO, and I'm going to split it into two parts because I think there's worthwhile doing that. The first part is to say one outcome of strategic forecasting could be very early identification of key drivers leading to undesirable outcomes, for instance, urbanization and in the built environment, and linked to flood risks. Is this a key aspect of your work? And how might one use the results in that way?
So it's not something that's been a core focus, I wouldn't say. But I have had similar thoughts myself as we've kind of gone through this exercise. I think that it is a very useful, in a sense, the kind of the narratives, the high level narratives are in themselves very useful. Even the kind of the abstracts are very useful in, as you say, identifying what are the kind of the characteristics or the decisions that lead us down certain paths, which may be more or less advantageous. So I think, you know, we can say something about that. The question probably then is, how do you get that into decision makers? And even more importantly, how do you get decision makers to take notice of it? You know, fundamentally, some of the kind of information we reflect in those narratives is also about political choices. And in political choices, you know, political choices often aren't rational, whether it's by parties, politicians, or indeed by the general public. So it's not. I wouldn't say it's all easy to sort of, you know, say, well, we need to avoid doing this and following this path because it leads to you know, a heavily fossil fuel dependent economy. But at the same time, there definitely are lessons to be learned and things we can take out of those narratives that will inform these kinds of discussions.
Maybe just
go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, maybe just to reflect on how we might use that information is there's lots of places have differential ability to avoid building in the floodplain. Let's just think of a simple situation. Like Hull, for example, really can't avoid building in the floodplain. Something like 90% of previous development has been in the floodplain. So if you're thinking, well, actually, there is also a strong growth demand in population growth demand in that area, then that starts highlighting, well, in fact, that policy of not building in the floodplain is not the right policy to manage that future development, but it might lead to other things. So we can, if you've got good information on where the populations might go and how you manage flood risk, will be differential across those. So you get a much greater spatial understanding of how you can escalate it to decision making and policy. You get a much more nuanced response if you've got that spatial component to the population or demographics.
I find myself wondering about the analogy with climate scenarios and the trend of trying to use the results to think of early warning indicators and design early warning systems. And I wonder if there's an aspect here, Paul or John, that could actually be used in that way, and whether we could use the language of early warning indicator design as an extra application of the scenarios.
Yes, I think so. I'm a little bit, I guess, guarded about this, partly because the scenarios here are in some senses predefined, right? There are existing descriptions of the SSPs or of each of the SSPs, and these overarching narratives already exist at the global level. Our exercise and the workshop exercise where we sort of informed the development of these narratives was largely about us as a group trying to think about, well, how could this come about? It's not to say necessarily that is the only way it could come about, attaching sort of likelihoods to these things. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's huge uncertainty at every stage of this, right? In a lot of senses, what we're doing here is a kind of a simplification that gets us, we think, to a credible story which could deliver each of the SSPs. But as I said at the start, they are just explorations of the kind of possibility space, and we need to bear in mind that even if there are even multiple ways to get to a single endpoint, let alone the different ways that could be got to the whole range of different potential endpoints that we're exploring in these SFPs.
Excellent, thank you. The next question we've got is from Helen. Helen says, interested to know how and if uncertainties or possible future changes in these links and dependencies can be captured by the framework. So can we say something about how the underlying dependencies may themselves change?
Yes, so there is, I mean, that in some senses that's built into this approach, right? And as I showed those causal loop diagrams for two different SSPs, and as we saw, they were very different in terms of not even just the strength of the links, but actually the presence of links, right? And the presence of these driving relationships. And that is reflecting, I think, that we see under these different SSPs very different drivers, very different sort of causal relationships. And I think it's entirely right to say that those are definitely not static. I think we could come up with a single version of this is what the political economy, if you like, looks like now, and this is therefore what the version of that causal loop diagram that represents 2020, or maybe 2019 to omit COVID effects. But and then as soon as you start looking at 2040 or 2070 or 2100, it's inevitably going to look different. And it looks different under each of the SSPs precisely because of the dynamics and the sort of the path dependency, if you like, that there is in within sort of socioeconomic systems. I think that the other part of her question was about sort of, can we use it to identify the unknown unknowns? And I think that is, to some extent, what this exercise is seeking to do. I mean, we've set out narratives, as I say, that deliver sort of the endpoints of the 5 different SSPs, but we're aware there's a huge amount of uncertainty about that, and we set out illustrative paths, but there clearly are other ways each of these scenarios could be delivered, and in some senses it's almost a hopeless exercise, right, trying to project socioeconomic projections out to 2100. I'm pretty sure if you'd asked the people of 1920 to put projections out to 2020, they'd have an economy that looks somewhat different to today's. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is we're only ever trying to set out illustrative examples, and we're aware of the challenges and the huge uncertainties that there are in any of these projection exercises, and those do need to be taken into account.
One of the interesting things for the wide range of socioeconomic projections, it might be that some of the adaptations, you can identify ones that are robust to those uncertainties. So sometimes it might reinforce what types of adaptations are best, because they manage that broad spectrum. So again, it's really useful from our perspective to have that wide range of projections, because you can start identifying which ones are the most robust adaptations from a flood perspective.
From a user perspective, when will the scenarios next need to be updated? How long will users have this stable set of scenarios for?
So these scenarios are going to be published and openly available, you know, sort of in perpetuity, if you like. You know, I think given what we've said about uncertainty, I would say that, you know, these obviously aren't the kind of things that need to be updated every year with the latest historical data, right? They're much more about the long-term trends and the long-term dynamics. There might be inflection points. We had a real struggle when doing this exercise, and I know that was also CEH's experience in the previous UK-SSPS project, trying to get these scenarios away from thinking about Brexit, which obviously was dominating everyone's minds, everyone's thinking at the time. So you clearly do get these kinds of, you know, inflection points, if you like, where you can suddenly imagine a whole different sort of future set of scenarios, or it fundamentally changes the way the UK interacts with the rest of the world. Hopefully those aren't too frequent, you know, and certainly not in the near future. But yeah, I think you know, all I'm trying to say is that there is I think quite a long shelf life to these projections. Potentially, they can inform things going out for at least the next 5 years, as far as I can see.
There's an interesting question from Matthew. Matthew is saying, well, these of course look forward from the present, but how much work has been done looking at the socioeconomic indicators from pre-industrial times to present, and can we make more from those linkages? I mean, I suspect you're already building in quite a lot of that learning from the past, but do you want to tell us how you use that information from the pre-industrial to present?
Yeah, so there are some sort of quantitative process. I wouldn't say we make use of data from pre-industrial to present, but, you know, we obviously, in thinking about trajectories for these indicators, we look at you know, the recent historical data, which is to say sort of the last 40 years or so of data, to understand what the evolution has looked like over that period and how that might inform it. If we're thinking about sort of the much longer time frames, I think that where that really feeds in is about the idea of transitions, right? And how transitions are managed, or can be managed, or just occur naturally. I mean, most previous transitions have just happened, right? I think we're probably at an age now where there is more government intervention in terms of transitions than previously. And I think there is something to be learnt there. And it's something that comes up quite a lot in other aspects of our work, thinking about sort of climate change mitigation more generally. I think the key thing to learn is that systems can adapt and change very quickly. Much more quickly than we probably have. We have a tendency to kind of think linearly, right? And to think about, I've observed this much change over the past 10, 20 years, therefore I expect a similar kind of rate of change in the future. But these transitions, certainly these kind of transformations, which is what we're looking at here in terms of the UK economy in the next 30 years to get to a net zero economy, you know, they happen very rapidly, and the pace of it you know, I think will surprise most of us, even probably surprise the most informed of us. So I think that's a key takeaway, you know.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question from the audience. This one comes from David Sexton. He says, as a provider of climate information, I can see how transient climate scenarios could be used alongside the SSPs. But some people like their climate information expressed at different levels of warming, 2 degrees or 4 degrees. How does this time-independent approach to talking about 2 and 4 degrees, how does that fit, and how is it that you can use these transient local SSPs with that framing?
I mean, I can talk about it from our perspective, and maybe Paul will have more to say about on the sort of the applied research side. We were very deliberate when we set out to do this work that we're setting out socioeconomic scenarios that are independent of climate change. That is the framework that's been used by the IPCC, is this you know, cross-referencing, if you like, between the SSPs and the RCPs. And of course, when you look at the kind of crossover, there are, or at least there should be, kind of probabilities attached, right? The socioeconomic pathways which rely on fossil fuels are much likelier to end up with higher RCPs, whereas the more sustainable focused scenarios much more likely to end up on the low end of climate change. But we've designed this project to kind of be independent of that. So although we make judgments or quantifications in terms of fossil fuel use, you know, and emissions, we don't explicitly tie that into, and we don't tie things like the population distribution into, okay, well, what are the flooding effects, and therefore where will people actually be able to live? That is the sort of, that's the next stage. That's the kind of work that Paul and his peers will be doing.
Paul, do you want to say something more on this one? Because I know you faced this question yourself.
Yeah, I face this quite often, this question. I think the socioeconomic projections are definitely inherently time dependent. So I don't think you can move time easily through those. So you wouldn't look at a projection that John's got for 2100 and say that's 2020. I think they are inherently time. So when we're looking at climate change and looking at our 2 or 4 degree future, and from a fluvial perspective, we are happy to trade time and space in that regard. So it's just, we're not so worried about when the 4 degrees happens or the 2 degree happens. So I think it's more like at the coast, where you get that difficult. You have to have some time framing, as well as the the time independent notion of a 2 and a 4 degrees. So I think the SSPs are definitely a time dependent aspect to it as well. So there is a bit of, you would have to think quite carefully about how you link up those sort of GMST type changes of climate with the SSPs, just to make sure you're happy that everything is on the same consistent time footing. I think that will be an ongoing discussion, and we know that sea level rise has lots of inertia issues that make that temperature change version a difficult beast.
I suspect we'll end up following up on this one offline for quite a long time to come.
For quite a few years, I think that one might roll. Yes.
I'd also thank Rachel for her question, which I think we've picked up on through the SSP RCP discussion. So I'm going to close the questions there. Could we just bring up the last slide that we can use to say what the coming seminars are? While that's coming up, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining, and I'd really like to thank our speakers. Our speakers, I think, have given a really good description of a data set that is going to be so valuable when it comes to the future climate change risk assessments and attempts to optimize adaptation as well. So you can see on the screen now that we've got coming up at the end of January a seminar that will focus on adaptable water management systems. And then that will be followed on the 10th of February by a project looking at the feasibility of domestic rain tanks. So very much getting down to that fine scale of adaptation. Register in the usual way through our website. And if you want to listen again to today's seminar or look at the slides, they'll be put on the website. So thank you very much.